The Unwanted. Chapter 17. Please note that this chapter has some disturbing events. That summer of 1975 brought more rain than the land could absorb. Swampy water had accumulated all over the city, creating fertile breeding conditions for insects that spread diseases at a rapid rate. Malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis were rife. In an attempt to contain the problem, the communist government assembled a healthcare system in which everybody was trained to take care of himself or herself. 3 times a week, a group of nurses would set up a table outside the community center to dispense a dose of quinine for everyone as a safeguard against malaria. Fortunately, my village had yet to be touched by any of the plagues. August rolled by sluggishly as the town adjusted to its reconstruction. One day, my aunt's husband came rushing into our house. For his past errors, he had spent a week at a concentration camp. Luckily, the government exempted my grandfather from the same hardship because of his disability. The day my uncle was released, he came to warn my mother of the news he had learned in the camp. All over the city, the communists had adopted a new strategy to break down capitalism, starting with the rich communities up in Chinatown and spreading to the outlying villages. It was a simple plan. Each day, the community leaders would pick out a target area at random. They ransacked every house in that sector, paying special attention to the once rich and famous. The object was mainly to find hidden treasure or evidence that linked the people to their sinful past. As the government agents probed through the owner's belongings, members of the household were pushed into a corner. Anything with monetary value would either be confiscated or destroyed immediately. If they found proof of the owner's involvement with an unacceptable past, depending on the degree of guilt, the person would either be taken away to a death camp or held for trial. Even the children did not escape the military search, since many cunning parents had learned to hide their treasure in or on their offspring. With my cousin's aid, my mother went through her belongings and separated the memorabilia that was related to her past life, particularly items linked to my father or Jimmy's father. She put them all in a shoebox, together with half of her jewelry. The other half of the jewelry still remained hidden inside my trousers. As night fell, my mother went out alone to the front lawn and buried the box. Next door, Zui's family was not as fortunate. The communists ripped his home apart. They left with his father handcuffed in the back of a military truck. Zui's mother ran after her husband, wailing like a wounded animal, as the vehicle drove off along the dusty road, spitting a dark fume of smoke at her face. My cousin Moonlight came up behind me as I was standing next to my grandmother on the front lawn watching the chaos next door. "Listen, Kian," she whispered in my ear, pointing at Tai Tong. "Please, will you give him this note for me?" She stuffed a small piece of paper into my hand. "Now? During all this?" I asked, unsure whether I had understood her correctly. "Yes, now," she repeated, before her parents could notice anything. Moonlight straightened up and stepped away from me. I walked next door, searching for Tai among his family. He stood tall next to his mother, with his arm wrapped around her waist to keep her from fainting. Mrs. Tong cried on her son's shoulder, ignoring the bystanders' curious stares. Zui's brother appeared proud and mature, considering the devastation of the situation. He did not notice me as I crept closer to him. Zui, on the other hand, stopped crying to look at me with surprise. "Sorry, Zui," I muttered to him. Zui did not answer me. I stood among his distraught brothers, feeling out of place as they gathered themselves up to go back inside their house. When Ty went past me, I nudged Moonlight's note into his hand. Before he had a chance to walk away from me, I said in his ear, "This is from Moonlight." He thanked me, and I ran back home. In the front yard, Moonlight smiled and winked at me. After waiting for the communists a few weeks, my mother realized that since the loss of her mansion, the new government no longer considered us a serious threat. Relieved, she went to retrieve her hidden possessions from the ground. To her dismay, the entire box had disappeared. After 5 hours of turning the lawn upside down, she concluded that the box must have drifted to sea due to the water current below the ground. Such occurrences were common when people buried things too deep in the soil. In the last few months of my mother's pregnancy, the stress was heavy for all of us. With nobody in my family working, she was forced to live off her jewelry. Her term also did not go as smoothly as she had hoped. More than twice in the last month, she experienced complications. The last bout of bleeding came with severe cramping, which led her to believe that the baby was coming prematurely. In her panic, she rushed to the hospital, where the incident proved to be a false alarm. She particularly regretted the waste of money, which she could ill afford. At about this time, the town leader summoned Lum for 15 days of community service, which would entail hard labor in a jungle 50 kilometers from town. Lum refused to go. To keep us from getting into trouble, my mother hired one of my cousins to replace him. The whole matter might have passed without anyone's notice. However, that unlucky day, the town leader accidentally discovered the crafty substitution when he was looking to nominate Lum as the group's guide. He found my cousin Lay instead of Lum. Even though Lum survived the incident with no significant trouble, the conflict between my family and Mr. Kiba, the town leader, took a new turn. To the commander, my mother's ability to hire a stand-in raised the possibility that my family was still withholding some fortune from the government. The situation pushed my mother and Lum further apart, so that now they hardly spoke a word to each other. Someone in town observed to her that they no longer appeared to be a couple at all. With every new day, my mother grew more restless and disturbed. The incessant rain and the tension of her advancing pregnancy erased any tolerance she had for petty irritations. One evening at dinner time, we sat together on the floor eating some salty fish with rice, prepared by my grandmother. Since Luan left, my grandmother had taken over the household chores of cooking, cleaning, and doing the laundry. If her arthritis had allowed, my grandmother could have been a good cook. But mostly, like that night, we were stuck with white rice and dried fish for supper. Lum spoke to my mother, who sat on the opposite side of him and was eating calmly. "Look at me," he said. My mother continued to eat her food as if nothing happened. Jimmy, on the other hand, jumped with a fear, looking at both of them. I held on to my brother's hands, knowing that he was on the verge of tears. My mother's silence enraged Lum even more. He yelled louder, "Why don't you look at me?" He slammed his fist to the floor. "I am not going to take this abuse any longer." Again, my mother's only response was an exaggerated detachment. "Don't toy with me, dirty." In his vehemence, the insult came out as a hoarse cry. He threw his half-eaten bowl of rice at my mother and marched outside to light a cigarette. Specks of rice spilled onto my mother's long hair and on her face, but she made no attempt to brush them off. Next to me, Jimmy began to cry. Sometime that night, Lum crept into my bed. Lying asleep on my stomach, I was not fully aware of his presence until my body was crushed by his weight. His hand covered my mouth, preventing me from making a sound. I woke up groggily, not understanding what was happening. His voice whispered next to my ear, "Scream, and I will break your neck." At first, I was sure I was having a bad dream, and I struggled to wake up. Lum brought me back to reality by tightening his grip on my face. I struggled for air, but I was not strong enough to break away from his grasp, and I felt myself suffocating. Surely I was going to die. "Please," I screamed in my head. I felt my brain swell like a balloon that was ready to explode. I wondered if Lulu had felt a terror of this sort before she died. Weakened, I stopped fighting. As soon as I ceased to move, Lum released his fingers to allow some air to rush back into my lungs. Eagerly, I sucked in life, choking on my own phlegm. "Listen to me, and listen good, little muck," he said in a hushed tone. "Some day when you grow up, if you ever have to blame this on anyone, blame it on your mother. She started this war first, the moment she destroyed my unborn child." His voice was nearby, but it sounded far away. Nevertheless, I understood what he said, as it seeped into my soul like ink. Outside, the night had deepened, with the moon beaming through its window. Its light drenched everything in the room, including the thick, claw-like fingers around my neck. Lum peeled the bottom of my pajama off, taking off his own clothes with one hand while continuing to hold me with the other. I was scared and humiliated, yet did not understand what Lum was about to do. In my confusion and panic, I felt paralyzed. Suddenly, a deep pain soared through my body in waves, while Lum grunted and rocked on top of me. I wanted to scream, but could not. My will to cry was gone, and all that was left in me was an emptiness that grew bigger and colder with every minute. Before he climbed off my body, Lum waved his fist in my face. "Keep this between you and me, boy, and maybe I will be more gentle next time. And if you are stupid enough to tell your mother about this, I will go after your brother next." He did not need to warn me about keeping my mouth shut. The shame and isolation I felt were not feelings I wanted to share with anyone. I lay with my head buried in the pillows, listening to his footsteps as he left, and trying hard to block out the humiliation that was eroding my soul. Long after he left, I remained naked and motionless on my bed. My mind was empty. I retreated into a white cocoon, just like death, cold and vacant, and at that moment it was the only comfort I could find.